Well, thanks for finding Discovery Class. Come on in. Have you ever heard the expression, you can't teach an old dog new tricks? That only applies to dogs. You and I can learn all kinds of new tricks. Question, do you have a purpose in life? If your life has meaning, chances are you're more likely to overcome hardship and take steps to stay healthy. Data has shown that people with a good sense of purpose in life tend to be goal-oriented in their daily activities, and their mindset contributes to longevity. Viktor Frankl, he was an Austrian. He was born into a Jewish family, and he was also a medical doctor. He was arrested by the Nazis and he was sent to Auschwitz, the concentration camp. 4 times he found himself in solitary confinement. The Nazis, they kept him alive because they wanted to show the Red Cross, who would often come in to inspect the camp, that they were honorable people and they were doing a good job in handling these people. But the Nazis were as crooked as a barrel of snakes. They weren't truthful. They gave Viktor Frankl no tools. He didn't have a stethoscope. He didn't have even a thermometer. All he had was his voice and his personality. And that's how he doctored many, many of his fellow prisoners. Amazing, this man, because there in the prison, he was one of the few that survived that terrible Holocaust. During his imprisonment, he discovered that some of his fellow prisoners were more likely to survive than others. And as a doctor, only using his voice and his personality, he learned that people who feel that life is meaningless and has no purpose usually are the ones that give up. And they lose their confidence to even want to live. After Frankl was freed from Auschwitz, he wrote a book explaining his newfound meaning in life. He entitled it, Man's Search for Meaning. That book sold 9 million copies right off the press. But he also went on and he wrote 39 other books expressing his prison discoveries. Now, they pretty well all said the same thing. Here's a simple summary that I find in reading many of his books. Thought determines behavior. Behavior determines character. And character determines destiny. Or, put another way, those who know the why in life can easily endure the pain in life. Moses, whom we're studying, has found himself in a setting that's really a prison of his own making. He's in an Auschwitz called the Desert of Midian. And from the penthouse in Egypt to the tent in the wilderness desert, from royalty to poverty, Moses doesn't know it yet, but a greater writer and survivor than Viktor Frankl is going to teach some wonderful lessons. Do you know what that Man's Search for Meaning book is? The Bible. That book, if you read it carefully, has all the tools, has all the stethoscopes, has all the thermometers, has every medical tool that you will ever need to survive in life. It's an amazing book. That's why I call our lesson the Bible Discovery Class. And every time we come to class together, we're making discoveries. And they're marvelous discoveries because they teach us how to live. You can go to the University of Calgary next to our church here, and you can learn the best skills on how to make a living. But that university isn't going to tell you how to live. This university will. Viktor Frankl is going to teach us some lessons in the desert school of learning. He did that in Auschwitz. But God is going to teach us some better lessons. God is going to be the teacher to Moses, and we're going to look over his shoulder and see what he tells him. I'll read it for you in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 10. God found Moses out in the wilderness in an empty, wind-swept wasteland, and he threw his arms around him, and he lavished attention on him, guarding him as the apple of his eye. He was like an eagle hovering over its nest, overshadowing its young. Then spreading its wings, lifting them and teaching them to fly, God alone led them. Get yourself into this setting. Pretend you're Moses. Maybe God set you down in a desert. Maybe it's a wasteland. Whatever it is, God thinks you need his experience. All other distractions you're going to find are going to be silenced. Nothing could be more quiet because God wants your attention. And all your wasteland, all your wilderness, they're all going to be different. What faces one of you isn't going to face the other, but it is still going to be a wasteland. The message, however, is going to be the same for each of you. You're going to receive counsel, and this book is also going to give you some wonderful teaching. And you're going to come out of that desert school with learning that's going to give you new thought, it's going to give you new behavior, and I'll bet it's going to give you a new character because it's going to determine your new destiny. You're going to know the why in life. Now, you might be listening, and fear has set in. I'm sure that's what Moses found. He was scared. He thinks all my life's experience and all my training are now gone right out the window. Can you identify with that? I'm going to be forgotten. I'm going to be useless, said Moses. For sure, time's going to be running out, and my clock is ticking. Worst of all, God left me behind. I'm never going to get out of here. Does that sound like somebody you know? Okay, I'm going to teach you 4 things, and they're going to come right out of this. It's going to be God's desert school of learning, I'm calling it. And from that passage in Deuteronomy chapter 32, beginning at verse 10, here are 4 things that I want you to remember. 1, God's going to put a ring around you. 2, God's going to rust-proof you. 3, God's going to restore your flight. And finally, 4, God's going to give you relief with some spring showers. Well, let's look at these and see how they apply. First, God's going to put a ring around you. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 10. He found him out in the wilderness, in an empty, waste-swept wasteland, and he threw his arms around him. Moses is going to spend 40 years in this desert school classroom. Then a whole nation is going to be led out of Egypt. He will lead them. In verse 2 of Deuteronomy 8, listen to these words. Remember this. God is going to lead you through the wilderness for 40 years. And he will humble you. And he will test you. And he will know what's in your heart. Whether you would keep his commandments or whether you won't. When your wilderness is windswept and wasteland, you need someone to throw their arms around you, and that's what God did. Some years ago, here in Calgary, a businessman, he sold his company, and he sold it for a lot of money. That company was owned by a man named Fred. He was the one that gathered the money in after he sold. His church that he attended was made up of students, dropouts, homeless, 18 to 30-year-olds, unemployed, and there were only a few in that congregation that had entry-level jobs. Most of those attending church were broke. They had no money. They were lost in their wilderness, and there was no one to throw their arms around them. You'll never guess what Fred did. That businessman, he talked to the management of the Palliser Hotel in downtown Calgary. And he rented the banquet hall on the top floor, and he hired the catering from the Palliser kitchen to supply all-you-can-eat buffet. The finest foods, everything that a young man would get on a cruise ship, he provided. He even went to the church and they had a little band, and he paid them to come and play the music while they were all celebrating and eating. That night, all the eating, all the drinking, all the singing was all covered by his expense. Fred was asked by the hotel president and the manager, "Why did you do that? Why did you spend all your money on them?" Here's what he said. "What you do for the least of these, you do for me." He was quoting his Lord. Fred, that night, he threw a ring around the arms of those desert wanderers. And throwing his arms around them, he was showing them that's what God does. He put a ring around them. Here's the second lesson from the Desert School of Learning. God's going to rust-proof you. In verse 11 of chapter 32 of Deuteronomy, I read, "God guarded you as the pupil of his eye." Did you know that your eyes are the most protected part of your body? Your skull has two openings, two round holes. They encase your two eyes. God shielded those eyes with great care. He covered them with eyelids. When you make a blink, that's the windshield fluid that cleans you like a windshield wiper. You take special care in guarding your eyes. That's why you wear sunglasses on a very sunny day. And you don't even let a speck of dirt ever come near your eyes, because if you do, you're sure to wipe it out and get rid of it. When you're in the desert, God guards you just like the pupil of your eye. That's rust-proofing. That's looking after your eye sockets. God knows that you need protection. Moses came to this desert at the age of 40. He was an alien. He didn't know anything about desert life. He came in at 40, and he's not going to leave until he's 80. He should be Pharaoh now. But instead, he's going to be just herding sheep. Moses is going to get rust-proofed. God's going to guard him as the pupil of his eye. And you know why God is doing that? The same reason he does it for you. You're in a wilderness. You know what a desert's like. You know what it's like to be discriminated against or your family deserts you. Well, Moses is going to be questioned. He's going to be attacked. He's going to be accused. He's going to be hated. He's going to be destroyed and betrayed. How can anyone face that? Well, you have to be rust-proofed from that very destruction. Corrie ten Boom, she faced that. She was a Dutch teenager, along with her older sister, Betsy, and her father. They were arrested by the Nazis in Holland, way back in World War II, because they were harboring Jews in their home. They were caught. They were arrested. They were sent to concentration camp in Germany. Both Betsy and her father died over there. Corrie made it out. Not before she died, almost died rather, of starvation and pneumonia. When she went into the concentration camp, she snuggled under her person, in her petticoat, a tiny Bible, and she read it every night to her fellow prisoners there in that concentration camp. And the Bible, hidden in her waistcoat, was her rust-proof. She had many dying prisoners before her led to Christ. She became their evangelist, their preacher, their prophet. Her memorized text she taught other prisoners, and they became the guardian of her pupils. It became her lesson in the desert school of learning. Isn't it amazing what God can do with nothing? And yet with this, he can make it something. Here's a third lesson from the desert school. Deuteronomy 32, found in verse 13. God was like an eagle hovering over its nest, overshadowing its young. Where I lived for many years on an island out on the west coast of Canada, there was a mountain on our island called Mount Daniel. It's just north of me where I live. And it was known for two things. One, it was a training ground for young girls. Two, it was the training ground for young eagles. Let me explain. The first to learn at the top of that Mount Daniel were young indigenous teenagers, 13 years old. They climbed that mountain, and it's very steep. I've taken my kids up there. We've seen it. When you go up the mountain with these young mothers and the grandmothers, they went up for 3 days. The stone circle is still up there at the top of that mountain. You can see it when you get to the top. And there they camped, the mothers and the grandmothers, for 3 nights. These teenagers, 13 years of age, were just coming into puberty. Their mothers and their grandmothers spent those 3 days preparing these beautiful little girls the responsibilities of womanhood. They were going to learn all the life skills that these elderly mothers and grandmothers possessed, and they were going to pass them on in these 3 days to these young teenagers. And they took the girls to the edge of the mountain that was very steep. It dropped all the way down, thousands of feet. And there, and then looking at the sheer drop-off, they showed these teenage girls another lesson. There below them, mother eagles were nesting with their chicks there on the side of the mountain. And then they began to teach them to fly. They would nudge them off the nest and make them fly on their own. Some of those little birds were terrified. Others floundered. Most of them flopped their wings for the first time. But always, underneath them, the mother eagle would soar, seeing them flounder, would fly underneath, and they would land on her back, and she would take them back to their nest. These indigenous little girls watched this. And they put 2 and 2 together, and they began to find that's what Mom and that's what Grandma is teaching me if I'm going to learn to fly in motherhood, and they're going to help me if I flounder, and they're going to take me back to my nest. That was a beautiful lesson. I'm not sure we teach that to our children, do we? I saw that. When I stood there, I was totally amazed because I pretended I was one of those mothers teaching my little daughter. And I was watching those eagles flounder, and yet none of them were lost, and they all made their way back, and they all grew up to be wonderful mothers themselves. They learned to soar on their own. And as these indigenous teenagers watched, they were reminded by these old women in their group that they were only 13 years old, but they were learning to fly. In Deuteronomy 32, God tells Moses that he's going to restore Moses' flight. In Psalm 51, verse 6, David says it another way, "Behold, you desire truth in the innermost being, in the hidden part. It's there. You will make me known in wisdom." The NIV Bible tells this eagle story in a different way, and I'll read it for you. "Like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that hovers over its young, he spreads its wings, and he caught them, and he carried them on his pinions. The Lord alone guided them." That's almost exactly as I described it for you. I saw it. If a young mother eagle won't let her baby fall, and if those indigenous mothers and grandmothers aren't going to let those little teenagers coming into puberty fall, what do you think God's going to do for you? Do you think he's going to let you fall? He won't. He's going to restore your flight. That was the promise he made to Moses here in the desert school of learning. He was told that God would restore his flight. Well, there's a fourth thing before you go. Here it is in the school of learning. Taught Moses. He was going to give him release with spring showers. What does that mean? Well, in Deuteronomy 32, or 32 rather, verse 15, read this. God took Moses to the hilltops so he could feast on the crops in the field, high quality wheat and grapes from the vine. When Moses fled Egypt into the Midian desert, he thought he hit a wall. His life was over. That was just nothing but a blank. Let me tell you about a wall. In Germany, the capital, Berlin, there stood a wall. It divided that city in two. It was part of the Iron Curtain, World War II. That wall stood for many years, almost 3 decades, 28 years. When Germany was free, on one side, they were free. On the other side, communist Germany was not free. There were guard shacks. There were sandbags. There were tanks. There was barbed wire. There was electric fences. There was 12-foot brick stone fence that separated the two German nations. There was only one little hole in the fence. It was called Checkpoint Charlie. And that was one of the openings where you could pass from east to west. Soviet and American tanks faced off against each other right there in 1961. Spies and defectors attempting that hair-raising escape died by the thousands. There were 2.7 million Germans that fled from east to west during that 3 decades. That Iron Curtain, 96 miles long, finally broke. The Berlin Wall fell. East and West Germany was reunited. And that reunification formally took place October the 3rd, 1990. And the whole world celebrated the fall of the Berlin Wall. God gave Moses not a wall, but a hilltop. What did he see? He feasted on the fields, yielding high-quality wheat and grapes from the vine. From this perch, in the desert school of learning, Moses had relief. It was almost like a spring shower. God had been caring for him more than in any other part in his life. He had already spent 40 years down there in Egypt in royalty. And now God was going to do more for him here in the desert than he did over there in the best of the country of Egypt. The desert is dry. It's lonely. You feel dismal. It's a place of sadness. But you're not alone. God's there. And when you're there, he's going to do this. He's going to put a ring around you. He's going to rust-proof you. He's going to restore your flight, and he will give you relief from spring showers, from a wall on the hilltop. Isn't that amazing? From the wall to the hilltop. God's going to do that. Well, when you stay with me, and we're going to journey through the life of Moses, there's some lessons there that I don't want you to ever miss, because they're brilliant. And we're going to learn them together. And if you can, come on back every week. And you and I are going to gather just like you're seeing me now. And we're going to march through this. And when you come out the other end, God's going to have you as a Moses, because he's going to lead you into something that you didn't expect. And that expectation is going to be your reward. See you then.